In Essential Task 9.7, we are going to discuss the major diagnostic category of dissociative disorders. There are only two disorders for our purposes today, though we are broadly going to define those under the dissociative disorders box here at the top. So with the three boxes in today's Essential Task, I think you could very easily hold this horizontally or, quite frankly, vertically if that's a preference as well. I will allow you now to pause the video before proceeding into the concept map. When we talk about dissociative disorders, we're talking about a categorization in which patients lose conscious awareness and become separated or dissociated from either their previous memories, their thoughts, or perhaps in some cases, their feelings. I will be honest, there is a reasonable amount of debate as to whether or not the dissociative disorders that we are about to talk about are in fact psychological disorders, or if perhaps they are byproducts of defense mechanisms, or whether or not in some cases they're even just fake. We will nevertheless address them head on, assuming that they are in fact real. They are located in the DSM-5. And we'll leave the debate element for another point. First disorder is what we call dissociative identity disorder. If we took this class many years ago, we would actually call this multiple personality disorder, but since it doesn't fall under the personality disorder categorization, that's really not an appropriate name. So we will call it, as we should, the term that is now used in the DSM-5, dissociative identity disorder, or DID. It's not impossible that culturally you hear people still use that multiple personality disorder term, but it is antiquated. It is outdated, will no longer be found in the DSM-5. Dissociative identity disorder assumes that an individual has one or more additional personalities, or two or more distinct and alternating personalities. The extent to which that is real is highly debatable. If we were to look at the brain of an individual with dissociative identity disorder who has been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, we would see regions of the brain related to trauma relatively more active. There is some belief that this is not necessarily really two distinct actual personalities alternating back and forth, but more so a defense mechanism in the aftermath of a traumatic experience, that this behavioral pattern in and of itself is a defense mechanism that an individual uses to maybe in some capacity deal with a really traumatic experience when they were younger, and not actually having one individual that has two personalities that sort of have to alternate between one another. There is a subtlety between those two, for sure. On the other end of the spectrum, some believe that this is more hypnosis than anything, that some of the best cases of dissociative identity disorder are elicited by therapists who ask persuasive and suggestible questions that elicit these symptoms that are not actually real and genuine, but are instead created by misleading questions. Additionally, there's some that argue that this is just a fad. If you look at some of the numbers, as we write more about DID, and there are movies about DID and books about DID, there are more cases of DID. Perhaps when we publicize this disorder, individuals begin faking it at higher rates, assuming this is a disorder which is faked. Again, at the same time, this is still highly contested and debatable. Nevertheless, we look at the word DID, simple mnemonic, D mean for double. I look at this and I think of double identity. Now, granted, there are individuals that have more than one additional identity, more than one additional personality. So isolating it just to two is not entirely accurate, but I think still double identity still helps as a mnemonic. The last one is what we call dissociative amnesia, often coupled with a fugue state. The College Board sometimes refers to this as dissociative amnesia with fugue. So do be wary that you can see that last term there, a fugue state, attached to a broader question about dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is when a patient has difficulty remembering their autobiographical information. It's almost seemingly like somebody hit the reset button on all of your long-term memories, and you may forget your name, you may forget your job, you may forget who your wife is, who your friends are, and you essentially need to regain all of that. You might, for example, end up, maybe perhaps as a result of something traumatic, losing all of the autobiographical information that pertains to who you are, and then basically having to re-meet all of these important people in your life. Like, this is your wife, this was your husband, this is your children, this is your job, this is what you did before, this is where you live. Sometimes that's coupled with a fugue state where an individual essentially wanders off into a location or into an area, into a place, and have no recollection of how they got there. And then sometimes, in addition to that, lose who they are. They lose that autobiographical information. So you could wander off 3 towns over and not know your name, not know where you're from, and people around you will probably have to ask you to look at their wallet, or ask to look at your wallet rather, to determine who you are by checking your ID. That fugue state element's not a necessity for dissociative amnesia, but it's very common to have that dissociative amnesia with fugue state element. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word fugue, it reminds me of the word Fiji. So I always think about wandering all the way to Fiji, showing up there and not knowing who you are, not knowing your name, not knowing your autobiographical information. I will end just because I think it's interesting to note. If anyone's watched the series Breaking Bad, the main character, Walter White, actually fakes a fugue state as a means of excusing some of his behavior to his wife. So there is highly contested debate out there within the field as to whether or not either of the disorders that we've talked about are real. Because if you wanted to fake them, it wouldn't be inconceivable to do so, really, with either dissociative amnesia with a fugue state or dissociative identity disorder.